Good evening and welcome to the It's All Greek to Me blog tour. I'm Dr. Paul Kiritsis and this is blog number 28. Today we're going to be discussing the Gnostic mythological document on the origin of the world. At times, one can marvel at the sheer scope of archaeological treasures that have come to light in the last few centuries. We have the discovery of the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, the excavation of ancient cities like Troy, Knossos, Pompeii and Herculaneum, and the unearthing of important historical artifacts like the Tarim mummies, the Turin Shroud, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once in a while, the discoveries themselves are entirely accidental and unprecedented. To give an example, in December of 1945, two brothers scampering about the mountain Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt in search of a nitrate-rich soil called sabak stumbled upon an old earthenware jar. At first, their superstitious inclinations thwarted their will to probe further, but the promise of reward, perhaps the discovery of gold or precious stones, quickly won out and they smashed it open with a mattock. To their dismay, there was no treasure to be had. There was only what at first appeared to be a worthless cache of 13 papyrus scrolls. Who'd ever want those, right? Unperturbed by their lack of providence, the boys hauled the jar home and showed its contents to their mother, who, being just as oblivious of the historical importance of the papyrological codices as her sons were, used up the first three as fuel for her oven. Then, for reasons which would evoke nausea and abomination in the vast majority of civilized readers, the family were forced to part with their booty, and all but one of the remaining leather-bound books changed hands a number of times before being seized by the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The other embarked on a worldly adventure of its own. It was smuggled out of the country surreptitiously and came to rest at the Jung Foundation in Zurich after illegitimate attempts to sell the manuscript through the black market proved fruitless. There, the manuscript caught the eye of a widely respected Dutch professor by the name of Gilles Quispel, who identified the script as Coptic and proceeded to translate a section of text which read, "These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke, and which the twin Judas Thomas wrote down." And that's from Pagels the book was published in 1989. Quispel was adroit enough to realize that the document was merely a spark, a fragment of a far greater and far-reaching religious phenomenon which had remained latent until now, and he dutifully published his finds in an attempt to attract the attention of scholars or literati in conscious or unconscious possession of other pivotal fragments. In the end, he hit the jackpot, for it wasn't long before the other 9 leather-bound books, now under the auspices of the Egyptian government, were identified as homologous cousins. Hence, the manuscript began a joyous pilgrimage back to its country of origin, Egypt, eventually finding a permanent home with the other 9 codices in Cairo. After some deliberation on the part of academics, archaeologists and historians, a decision was made to name these codices, which of course was an assortment of 52 texts and 46 different works of mythological, apocalyptic and polemical nature, the Nag Hammadi Codex, more commonly known as the Nag Hammadi Library. The 13 codices and their individual tractates were then enumerated for scholarly reference. Written in 3 languages, Greek, Coptic, Egyptian and Jewish, the texts themselves betray the existence of a heterogeneous assortment of religious communities that called themselves Gnostics, and believed that they had access to revelatory spiritual insights known as Gnosis, or the Gnosis falsely so called by their pejorative detractors. There can be no doubt that the Gnostic movement was variegated and broad, thriving along the eastern Mediterranean basin for at least 4 centuries. The religion's most influential advocates were the Samaritan magician Simon Magus and the emanationist Vassiliavis, both of whom were assiduous, unrelenting, and dogged in their determination to spread what they perceived to be the true light. Given that the respective cult centers of the aforementioned advocates were Syria and Alexandria in Egypt, it should come as no surprise to learn that the mythological notes of the Gnostic religion were at their sharpest and most reverberant there. And, as we shall soon see, the mythological tradition which underpinned Gnostic cosmogony was especially rich in symbolism and meaning. The intervals, chords, and musical scales formed by the notes of the Gnostic religion were extremely complex and multifarious in nature, and deceptively so. What we see in codices like the Apocryphal of John, the Hypostasis of the Archons, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and on the origin of the world, is that while there may be differences in the concrete details of each text, they all seem to revolve around the same harmony, the same mythological totem pole. There's ample evidence to support the notion that the Gnostics did a fair bit of borrowing from other religious and philosophical traditions. The idea of God's absolute transcendence, the division of the cosmos into 7 realms with gates guarded by hostile daemons, the cosmic polarities of absolute spirit and absolute matter, the ascent and descent of incarnating or reincarnating souls along the rungs of the cosmic ladder, as well as a host of other eschatological concepts, all have their origin in Neo-Pythagorean and Neoplatonic thought. For the Gnostics, the divine realm in which the ethereal fire burned was called the Pleroma. God, the wholly unintelligible and incomprehensible transcendental being that could only be described through negative theology, filled this space in its entirety. He had existed for time immemorial, bound up in a blissful state until the first rumination, which unravelled as he hovered over the primordial waters and caught sight of his own reflection. This first cogitation incited an awareness of his own ineffable nature and anatomy, a phenomenon which birthed the spiritual and material eons. Here, eons might be described as divine attributes, but they are also dimensional whirls of time and space. His brooding above the primordial chaos caused ripples which radiated outwards and gave life to a disembodied female entity known as Enia, or thought. Some of the mythological treatises call this being Barbel. Her subsequent union with the Divine Father, now termed Vithos, yields supernal light in the form of Christ. Thus we have arrived at the original trinity of Father, Mother, and Son, before the ecclesiastical leaders jettisoned the Great Mother from the realm of pure, undefiled spirit and replaced her with a neutral entity in the Holy Spirit. According to Christian Gnostic theologian Valentinus, the first cogitation produced 4 divine couples or syzygies. In the divine order, Vithos, which means depth, and his female equivalent, Enia, or thought, were immediately followed by the male-female pairings of Nous, mind, which is mind, and Aletheia, which is truth, Logos, which is word, and Zoe, life, and finally Anthropos, man, and Ecclesia, the church. So they're the 4 divine couples. This part of the Gnostic myth bears a striking resemblance, of course, to the Hermopolitan Ogdoad of Egyptian creation myth, where there are 4 pairs of frog-headed gods and serpent-headed goddesses, Nun and Nornet. Then we have Ammon and Amonet, Her and Horhet, and finally Kuk, or Kuk, if you want to pronounce it that way, and Korket. And they're the first paraphysical beings to emerge from the primeval ocean and carve up the universe with their knives.